Pintastic. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is John Egan. I'm an engineering manager here at Pinterest on the growth team, and I wanted to welcome you all to our growth engineering meetup. So we've been running this for about... We've been running this for about 3.5, 4 years now. We usually meet once a quarter, and when we first started this, the reason we started it was because growth was a big topic that a lot of people talked about, but there was a lot of forums that talked about the marketing side of it or the product management side of it, but there wasn't a lot of forums that talked about the engineering side of it. So we started this about 3.5, 4 years ago to give a forum for engineers that are working on growth at scale to talk about the work they're doing and start to build a community around it. So I'm glad today that we have a great lineup. We have speakers from Airbnb, Twitter, and Pinterest. And so I wanted to kick things off with our first speaker. Our first speaker, Ganesh, is from Airbnb, where he leads guest growth at Airbnb. He has over 20 publications, and he also has 16 patents filed in machine learning and in search. So please give a warm welcome to Ganesh.
Hi, thanks for coming, and thanks for that kind introduction. Why did I put a tiger's slide over here? Let me explain, right? So this is, if you had lived long enough in Bay Area, you'll realize that back in 2011, there was an attack of a tiger on a few teens. I'm actually not, I don't have too much experience in growth. I joined Airbnb 8 months or so back, and I started working on growth. And then I realized that this meetup had a lot of people who have a lot of experience in growth. So I feel like I'm a single person with a lot of tigers in the room. So don't maul me. I'll try to pass on the wisdom that I have, but in all likelihood, you know a lot more than me. And catch me offline, and then if I can't answer something, I'll direct you to the right people. So we're going to talk about paid growth. So let me grab it. John reminded me that it's good to introduce why you want paid growth. So I added a few slides to explain this. So this is an ad for, I hope you can see this. This is an ad for, when I searched, actually I did this search today, options for home security on Google. And this is a screenshot from my Mac, which is this one. It's a reasonably big screen. And out of that, this entire section is ad. Okay, so even the one that says shop for options on Google is actually ads. The sponsored is really small, that Google doesn't want you to see that slide, but it's actually ads. And then you have organic search results in the bottom. So then, what about the phone? This is flat screen TV, and my entire phone is just ads. And then Paris hotels. This is actually worse because I didn't put the screenshot here. I scrolled, and then in the fourth scroll, I got into organic search results. So not going to judge Google for this. They also need to keep their lights on. But whenever you have a purchasing intent in the end, notice it next time. A lot of it is ads. Google Shopping is ads. Flight search is ads. Hotel search is ads. So why do you want paid growth? One thing important about this is that there are various forms of marketing, like for example, traditional TV marketing, where you may put an ad and you may not know whether it's effective or not. One great thing about paid growth and performance marketing in general is that you can actually control your spend. And you can also measure whether it is effective in the end, which makes it a fantastic tool for controlled targeted spend. And it's also useful you can't just get SEO results right away for your product, right? But you can pay your way through to get SEM results or other forms of advertising results. And finally, you may not have a choice because of the slides that I showed earlier. If you're selling a product, a lot of these ads don't even look like ads, which is intentional. So you may not actually have a choice. So these are some of the reasons why you may want to go do paid growth. And especially key takeaway is if you have a purchasing intent in the end, then I think the third bullet is the most important one, right? And one more slide on why data can be deceiving. This is the first thing that I learned when I started working on paid growth. Is this is called a brand query, where I'm typing in Bank of America. A lot of times when I want to go to Bank of America or Wells Fargo, I type it in Google because I do believe that it won't be a phishing site if I misspell Bank of America, and you could go into a phishing site. Now, any idea why Bank of America has an ad and then the first result is also Bank of America? Any idea why Bank of America wants to advertise?
Because they want you to think the second result is not.
That could be one reason. Yes, exactly. If they don't do it, someone else will. That's actually a big reason why they do it, right? But is it actually, so when Bank of America advertises or anybody advertises on brand, a lot of clicks might actually come from SEM result, but does that mean that you're driving conversions or whatever the metric is through it? Not so sure. Should look at this paper by eBay. It's a fantastic paper. In 2015, where eBay studied the effect of SEM versus SEO, and they actually found this on the right. They ran an experiment where they turned off SEM, and SEM is search engine marketing, which is the ads, and then somehow the SEO results went up, meaning that it wasn't actually incremental to do advertising for their brand. So if they relied on just the clickstream data, they would have never figured out, and I don't remember, but there was an enormous amount of money saved by doing this particular test. It was in tens of millions of dollars, if I remember right. So something to note that as well. Your data could be deceiving. Don't just rely on clicks. You may have to do tests. It's not clear whether you should advertise brand fully or not. If you have a brand to advertise, it's better to run these tests. Okay, so that brings us to the core topic where I want to discuss multi-touch attribution. One more thing you want to figure out in ads is you may have different channels by which the user may come in, and you want to figure out whom to give credit for. So for example, let's say someone's trying to book on Airbnb, right? They find an ad on Google, then they go back home, they don't book, they search a bunch of listings, discuss with their spouse, etc. And then they're retargeted again on Facebook. They click on that ad, but they don't book, but they still are browsing and trying to figure out whether I should travel here or not. And then they come back on their desktop and then they book. So you have three channels, right? There's SEM, there's Facebook advertising, and direct. Who do you give credit for? That's the topic of today's discussion, to figure out what are some best practices to figure this out. And the reason why you want to do it is you may have a particular marketing budget. And as I said before, data can be deceiving, and you may have to figure out how do I allocate budget between Google and Facebook and Pinterest and all other channels. And this is a good way to do it. So traditional solutions, they usually have, give them all equal credit or weighted credit or recency. There's also this concept of last touch attribution where whoever got it last gets all the credit, but all of these actually it's fairly straightforward to figure out that all of these actually have issues. The other way to do is just do a lift test. You can look it up. I don't want to go into the details of lift tests. That's not what I want to cover in this topic. You can do a test where some users are never shown ads, and you can figure out whether this particular channel is effective or not. But the problem with lift test again is that you have to do it per channel basis, so you may have to run a lot of tests. And the second issue with lift test is that it does cost you your growth, because for a section of users, even though they might be effective to show them ads, you may not show them, just for the purpose of measuring, right? So there is a concept of statistical multi-touch attribution where you do a modeling-based approach to figure this out. There are usually two algorithms, Markov Chain model and Shapley. Anybody with economics background here? Oh, great. You're all special tigers, so please don't maul on me. Shapley is directly from game theory economics. Markov Chain model is essentially you try to figure out the transition probabilities from one channel to another. you create this Markov chain where you have from one channel, if a user arrives on one channel, what is the probability that it will go to another channel? And this is something you could potentially find from your logs. And let's say you have this kind of a transition gram. I'm just using the word generically channel. It could be any marketing channel. It could be direct, email, notifications, anything, right? And what you essentially do is that if I cut off one particular channel, then what is the final contribution? That will get you to a point where you can accurately measure the marginal impact of one particular channel, right? So in this case, for example, this is a fictitious graph. There's no, I made these numbers up, okay? And then C1 is a particular channel that you want to measure your conversion on, and then you can go ahead and do that. The issues with Markov chain is that you can't attribute a particular conversion part, and it also assumes a causal relation that you went from channel 1 to channel 2, but going to channel 2 was because you were in channel 1, which is a very strong assumption. So those are some issues with Markov chain. And then comes Shapley value, right? This is a very interesting concept. You can Google on this and look it up on, there's also a YouTube video on Shapley attribution. I don't have any idea about economics. I don't have a background in economics. But let's forget about attribution, forget about paid growth, and think about just a bunch of salespeople making a sales call. Sometimes they make sales calls together, right? And let's say you have 3 salespeople, and if nobody makes a sales call, you get 0. And if one person makes it 7, and if B and A together make it, then they still get 7, etc. So you have this data that of all 6 combinations of folks making the sales call, now you want to figure out the marginal contribution of each player. That's not necessarily, by the way, that's not necessarily 7, 4, or 6. Because when they work together, the dynamics become different. You want to figure out the contribution, right? In order to figure it out, Shapley makes some axiomated assumptions. And you can go through these axioms, but I'll explain them in more plain English, right? The important ones. It makes an assumption that you have the value of everyone is, if you sum up the value of every person, then you get the total value. Fair assumption. And the second assumption that it makes is symmetry. If 2 people, their contribution is interchangeable. That is, if you have one person in the sales, whether John or Jane sits in the sales call, you get the same value from the sales, then they should have the same value, which goes towards fairness, essentially. And it's also, there's a dummy axiom. If you add a person and the person doesn't contribute anything, then the person gets 0 value. That's also fair, right? And there's also an additivity assumption that the sum of the values is equal to the sum of the individual values, right? When you have all these assumptions done, I went through this proof actually. It's fairly intuitive. It's not that hard if you study the proof. But it's beyond the scope of this topic and it'll probably put you to sleep. Essentially what Shapley does is that if you assume that these axioms are true, then it proves that this is the only formula that can fit that axioms, right? So what does that mean? What does this really mean in terms of, now let's get back to paid growth, right? What it really means is that if you know the incremental contributions for all combination of channels, if I use only one channel, then I get this much benefit. If I use channel 1 and 2, I get this much benefit. 2 and 3, I get this much benefit. 1, 2, and 3, I get this much benefit. Then you can accurately compute the marginal benefit of each of these channels, provided the axioms are true, which seems like reasonable axioms. So,
Not really, because the assumption is that they're equal. And one of the things we did, that's why we track each step in the marketing funnel, is to see who actually added value and got them to the next step in the marketing journey or the sales journey. Because you may get their contact, you may get a follow-up email, you may get them to like a thing or share it to someone else. Those are all steps you can track, and you can track who the element was that led it to by A/B testing.
yeah.
So it's a good early thing, but now that we have that ability to look at the data and track which thing contributed to it, even with cookies and following every shadow profiles on like social networks, we actually don't need to assume.
Yeah, sure. This is just an extension for this complicated formula. I wrote it down for 3 players, and assuming some fictitious values, you can plug in this formula and directly. And then, by the way, just so we're sure, it's not that hard to derive this. There are wiki pages that will go through it, probably 15, 20 minutes, you should be able to understand how these things are derived, right? So that's Shapley. It seems fairly straightforward, right? You collect for all channels, and then you find all combinations, plug in the formula. What do you think is the difficulty level here? Anything? Exactly. You guys are smart. So, curse of dimensionality, that's just a fancy word for saying that if you have way too many channels, then you can't get all combinations. Irrespective of how big your data set is, once you start adding one channel, it exponentially explodes the number of combinations, and therefore getting the data for all channels, all combinations of all channels is actually not tractable, right? So what do? Some recommendations, I actually don't know what you do, but I'm just giving you some recommendations. For this, you train a machine learning model. So basically you say that you use feature engineering and you do feature sharing between the channels. So what you do is essentially, I don't have the data for C1, C2, C3, but there may be a common feature set between C1, C2, C2, C3. Therefore, I train a model and do the computation. So that's one way out. There could be better way out of this situation. I'm happy to hear thoughts on that as well. So we discussed, just to recap, paid growth, you may have to do it for multiple reasons. One of them being you may not have a choice. And there are, when doing with paid growth, don't just trust your data directly. You will have to measure incrementality, and you also have to measure the marginal contribution of each channel. There are a couple of techniques that you could use potentially to measure attribution. You could use Shapley, or you could use Markov, or maybe there are other techniques. Even within these two, there are pros and cons. If you really think that the state assumption is valid in yours, and if you have a strong intuition that it is, then Markov could work. If you believe that the causality is loose, then Shapley value could work better. So it depends upon your situation. I'll stop there and pause for questions. Yes. You're modeling it.
Hey,
so
Ganesh,
the question is, sorry.
Can you repeat the questions after that?
Can you repeat the question?
Basically, does the Shapley formula still confer value if you're using ML modeling on an actual instance?
The question is, does the Shapley value confer values if the ML model is actually doing the thing? It depends upon your ML model. So ideally, you shouldn't be using the ML model. If you have low number of channels and you have enough data, you can get away without using it. But unfortunately, you will hit a point where you don't have enough data. At that point, it really depends upon how good your ML model is, right? And if your ML model accurately models and you do the right principled way of hold out and test it, if it holds, it'll be good. If it's not, it doesn't. And even in Shapley, it makes some axiomated assumption. You have to check if those axioms are valid for your use case. So the question is, why did you build this internally instead of using third-party tool, and how did it impact? The second question, unfortunately, I can't answer because, for sensitive reasons. The first question, I think we constantly have this build versus buy argument. We did look into lots of third-party data, but the thing is that we have to use a lot of, for this transitions and stuff, we have to use your internal data. You'll have to give them to third parties, etc., which didn't make a lot of sense for us. So built it internally.
Was it because of just IP issues, competitive, or was it the fact that you felt like internally you had enough data to actually really be able to normalize it? Because a lot of people use external frameworks to normalize against their own biases they're seeing for the there's a lot of groups that actually share this, like the hackers and funders, badass marketers and founders, where you have to see across it, because a lot of times you'll end up with your own biases built into your data set that you need to see where you're off the edge.
I think that's a good question. The question is whether, how do you handle biases when you use your own internal tools? Yeah, I think we trust that our internal teams are very consciously aware of it. We have a bunch of ML engineers and data scientists who work constantly on that problem. So fairly confident that problem is okay with us. And more importantly, we have data, and I think it's better that the data stays internal. So okay, and you can catch me later if you want. Okay, thank you.
By the way, we're recording the event, so
All right. So our next speaker comes from Twitter, where he's been at Twitter for 4 years, and he works as an infrastructure engineer on the onboarding team. And today he's going to talk about some of the work they've been doing to improve Twitter's onboarding. Please welcome Michael.
Hey, thank you so much. My name's Michael, and I'm from the onboarding team. And today I'm going to be talking about a system called the Onboarding Component Framework. And we use this to help users to perform actions so they can improve the health of their account and get more value out of Twitter. And the core idea behind this infrastructure is we use the backend to drive these user experiences using generic client-side components. And by having the backend kind of control everything, we've had a lot of improvements in terms of flexibility, iteration speed, and personalization. So I'd like to present that to you guys. So in this talk, we're going to be talking about the goals and problems that our team kind of experienced and how the onboarding component framework kind of helps deal with that. I'll give you a few examples of some of the experiments that we've run and then talk about the impact of the system as well as some learnings that I hope you can take back to your company and apply to some of the problems that you may be experiencing. So to start things off, I'm from the onboarding team, and what we're responsible for is for the experience of new users, to put it plainly. And what that means is we really want to help users to find the value of Twitter, to set up their account properly, and to help them find relevant features and content. But in 2016, we were having a lot of problems where that slowed down our speed and limited how much impact we could make. So I'd like to kind of set the stage and talk about some of the problems we were experiencing to kind of showcase the motivations for why we built the onboarding component framework. So the first problem that we had was all of our new user experiences were hard-coded on the client side. And it turns out that client-side experimentation is actually really expensive. For example, if we wanted to run an experiment that removed the follow step from sign-up, that would take 3 engineers 6 weeks to build. And the reason for that is because we'd have to make changes on 2 different clients as well as the back end. And we'd need 6 weeks because we need to wait for client releases. There might be bugs. There might be delays. So what this kind of meant is, like, if we were running an experiment, we could only do 2 iterations per quarter. And we thought that this was a little too slow. The second problem that we kind of had as a team was reach. So our team is responsible for the experience of new users. So unlike a team like notifications or timelines that kind of has a clear product surface and of ownership, we needed to kind of contact and help new users no matter where they were, whether that's on the timeline or notifications. And that made things really hard. Like if we wanted to run a post-sign-up experiment, all of our features would kind of be spread across many different code bases because we want to help the users from the timelines and the notifications. And as an example, if we wanted to run an experiment that prompted users to complete their profile, maybe like 5 days after they've signed up, that would mean adding code to 2 or 3 different backend services, as well as code to parts of the client that we didn't own. And this made maintainability and kind of observability, and we just have to get code reviews from other teams. That was a pain. And I'm sure you guys all know. But basically, we kind of lacked a sense of ownership, and a lot of these features ended up being poorly cared for in the long term. The third problem that we had kind of with a hard-coded client-side new user experience was it was really hard to target different variations. So because it was all on the client side, if we wanted to target a feature like a special World Cup sign-up, we wouldn't really be able to write machine learning models or use heuristics and tune those if it's all written on the client side. So we really feel that users come to Twitter for a variety of reasons. It could be to follow news or politics or just Kanye. And and basically, we felt that we were really underserving our users in this aspect. So just to kind of recap, the main problems we were having were slow iteration because of client-side development, lack of maintainability because we were spreading our features too thin across multiple services, and a lack of personalization. So in early 2017, we began work on a system called the Onboarding Component Framework. And we kind of constructed this to address a lot of these problems. So the idea was to have a centralized system that could prompt users to complete actions to promote healthier usage of the platform. And the idea, the crux of this was we would have UX flows that could be selected and powered by the server side using generic client-side components. So essentially, instead of the client saying, okay, these are the screens that I need to show, the client, once it's inside of a flow, would continually ask the back end, what UI should I show next? What task should I show next? And that kind of flip helped us to fix a lot of these problems. So to kind of go into a little bit more detail, we had a backend system that tracks what tasks a user has completed and provides client instructions on what to display. The clients would then interpret these instructions and use generic UI templates to capture user data. The client would take this user data, send it back to the backend. The backend would process this user data, and then the backend would send down another series of tasks to be for the client to show. And this loop, this event loop, would kind of continue until the backend says, okay, this flow's done. So I'd like to break down some of like the core building blocks of the OCF. So the first thing I want to talk about is the subtask. So this is a UI building block, which is kind of like the most core fundamental part of the system. And this is essentially an instruction that the server sends down to the client, and it represents one screen. There's a JSON contract between the server and the client that's agreed upon, and that JSON includes fields that modify different aspects of the UI. So some of the configurable aspects that would be specified in the JSON include stuff like the text, the button links, and the layout. So we really tried to keep these subtask definitions really, really generic so that the backend has the maximum control over how the display appears on the UI, on the client side. So to give you an example, I guess it's a little hard to read. Oh, it's not too bad. This is the JSON that would be sent down if we wanted to instruct the client to show a subtask for an alert dialog. So you've probably all seen an alert dialog before. But the backend is able to specify aspects like the primary text, the secondary text, the labels, and we design it in such a generic way so that we can reuse these if we need to do other types of alerts for other types of applications. So now that you have an idea of how the server can kind of instruct the client to show different types of UI elements, how do we, string these together to get users to perform actions? So how this works is the server sends down a collection of subtasks that the client then renders and then kind of goes through and collects the user data. We call this collection of subtasks a task. And this kind of represents an action that the user needs to complete and is like a functional building block of the OCF. So the idea is the client renders these subtasks and collects all the user inputs, and then at the end of that, sends that back to the backend for processing. So you can think of a task almost like one client-server interaction. Examples of these actions include user creation, selecting interests, and address book upload. So to give you a more concrete idea, this is the sign-up flow. So if you guys open the app today and signed up, which I'll encourage you to do, you would see this as your first task. And this is the task to create an account on sign up. So each of these screens are different subtasks with their own, where the server specifies things like the copy, like use email, specifies things like the buttons and how they're linked together. And essentially, this is all sent down as one server payload. The client then renders all of this and collects all the user input and then returns that back to the backend, after which the backend can create the user. So we have these kind of action building blocks that we can kind of use and repurpose. So you can imagine an action being like address book upload can be used both in sign up or resurrected user flow or at any point. So we have these things, and when we string them together, we're able to create coherent user experiences. And when we string these tasks together, we call them flows. So the sign-up flow is a great example of this, where the first task creates the user's account. The second collects the password and sets it. The next uploads the address book. The next selects interest. And then finally, follow recommendations. So hopefully this kind of gives you a good idea of how we can construct these UI flows and power that all from the back end. But how exactly can we access and start these flows? Well, the OCF is kind of available over API, and the client is able to call and start these flows directly. A good example of this is when you first install the app. Hopefully you've all done that right now. You can click Get Started, which will trigger the flow, and then the server is able to send down the appropriate server UX flow. Another great example of how it can be started is the OCF is integrated with the timeline. So when the timeline is refreshed, we have the opportunity to send the user an injection, either a half cover, full cover, or inline injection. And that allows us to kind of deal with one of the issues that we were talking about earlier, where we were having a hard time reaching users after sign up. So by doing it through timeline injections, we're able to kind of access all of the users on Twitter. And great examples that use this include username and profile completion. So now I'd like to give you an idea of some of the experiments that we've run and how they've kind of changed the way that our team operates. One of the first experiments that we've run was removing the follow recommendations step inside signup. So historically we had invested a lot of resources in kind of the relevance aspects of the follow recommendations, but we wanted to actively measure how this compared to kind of organic follows. So we ran an experiment where the control bucket included the standard user recommendations, whereas the treatment bucket just didn't make any recommendations and dropped the user into an empty home timeline. I mean, I think pretty obviously the control bucket had a healthier social graph and increased retention. But I think what was really important was it allows us to measure how effective those recommendations were and whether or not we should invest further in that space. So it was very successful, actually. So we ended up investing more in post-sign-up new user resurrection. So this is an example of how an experiment was, because it was very easy to run, we were able to just do it, measure it, and use that to kind of quantify our future work. All right. Here's another example of how easy experimentation with the OCF enables us to make better decisions. So we had a stakeholder come to us and say, hey, you should include a birthday on sign-up. It'll help with things like ads and personalization. And instead of just saying, no, we don't have time to run an experiment for that, because it was fairly easy to run an experiment, we could just set it up, and we were actually able to quantify the trade-offs between sign-up and these other business metrics and kind of say, okay, this is the trade-off. Is this something that we want to do? And we could make the right decision for our users. The last kind of set of experiments is one that we're actually starting to run right now. And it's for resurrected users. So if a user is dormant for a while and then they come back to the platform, we kind of want to give them an experience to kickstart their account, to help them find their friends again, or help them find new accounts to follow, something to make Twitter interesting for them. And what was really cool is because we had built all these tasks for sign up already, we were able to reuse all of them for a resurrected user experience. And we actually didn't have to do any client-side coding, and we were able to build and inject this new resurrected user experience without any client work. So currently we're kind of running a bunch of experiments on the format, the copy, what kind of tasks should be included in this, and we're also starting to work on some of the targeting aspects. So what kind of users should receive this? And that kind of ties into the personalization stuff I was talking about earlier. Okay, cool. So impacts and learning. So let's kind of resume back to some of the problems we were having before. So now instead of an experiment taking 6 weeks to run, they take 1 week to run. And instead of 3 engineers, they take 1 engineer. And the reason why is because all the experiments can be run from the back end now using all these generic components that we've built up. From a maintenance perspective, all of our features now exist inside this one centralized service. So that means it's a lot easier to maintain. Everybody knows the code that we're working on. It's not just some abstract knowledge where we're sprinkling code throughout all the code bases. And then finally, we're now able to kind of start personalizing and targeting these different experiences to users. So we've already run 10 experiments since January, which is quite a lot. And we've already started to affect Twitter top-line metrics, which is very cool. And another surprising thing, we mostly built this kind of framework for onboarding usage, but it's actually kind of started to become a platform for rendering native UX flows throughout the company. Okay, so if you guys took a nap, this is the most interesting slide. Basically, I think that the problem that we were encountering, where we're having trouble iterating and running experiments and personalizing, I think if you guys are experiencing any of those problems in any workspace, you can learn from these kind of 3 key takeaways. And the first of which is you want to move as much logic to the server side as possible. When you're developing on the client side, you have to deal with client releases, hot fixes, whereas on the server side, you can monitor everything and you can do a deploy in the middle of the night and it's no big deal. And it's just, it just makes development and iteration a lot faster. The second thing I'd recommend is to centralize your feature logic. If you're like our team and you're kind of responsible for a certain type of user or a certain kind of type of experience that kind of transcends standard surfaces on the app or whatever product you're working on, then really kind of bringing that together into a centralized service or library that you can monitor and really own will really help your iteration speed and will help you kind of like better manage and support your features going forward. And kind of tying in, the last thing I want to talk about is reusing components and the features that you build. I think sometimes when we work on growth, it's easy to write a feature and then kind of launch it and then, yay, it moved metrics and then kind of forget about it. What's really powerful about the OCF is every experiment that we're adding new subtasks, we're adding new tasks, we're expanding the functionality, and that kind of like snowballs and can be reused in future experiments. So I think what's really cool about the OCF is the fact that it's compounding. Every experiment we run is not just an experiment. It's building parts that we can use for future experiments. So kind of reuse there is a pro tip, I think. So I just want to, I hope you guys learned a little bit about how Twitter does onboarding, and I hope you can take some of the lessons we've learned back, because I think new users need all the help we can get. Thanks so much. Great. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. This is awesome. So the way that this component framework works requires the backend to be able to talk to the clients, right? So what about, if you wanted to expand globally into areas with no internet or something, or the user goes offline, how do you deal with that situation?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think most of our apps these days kind of go online at some point. And you could imagine like extending this framework to kind of cache some of these instructions or like kind of like store them for a long period of time. That could be one approach. That's actually not an area that we've actually thought too much about, unfortunately. But great question.
Yeah, most things are online even if they're IoT. How did you see the iteration? I actually remember the workflow when you guys changed that. Was that what led to you actually deciding, instead of having people focus on recommended, people actually being able to go to their other networks like log in with OAuth and connect with their friends there? Because I noticed there was a decision point there. And all of a sudden the focus now is you log into Twitter, you actually can see like, are you Facebook, let's get your contacts in there off the phone. Is that decision driven by that metric and some of the stuff you saw with those experiments?
I'm not 100% sure about that feature in particular, but what I can say is like with this new infrastructure, we're more willing to kind of make big feature changes, whereas before we were kind of focused a little bit more on maybe like the relevance aspects. But now with this new system, we can experiment a lot quicker on kind of the feature aspects of things and how things look.
What are some areas that you still want to like attack that you can talk about that maybe other people in the industry are seeing solutions for?
Yeah, I think something I alluded to was kind of like personalization. I think that's like an area that we kind of want to explore more. Oh, yes, please.
Hey, this was a great talk, thanks. Curious, the examples that you showed were on the native apps. How does this work across desktop and mobile web as well?
Great question, yeah. We're actually currently working on working on web currently. Initially, it was just for iOS and Android, and we're currently working on our web to support this as well. That's a great question. I mean, the way that we kind of organized building things was around milestones, and the idea was, okay, what are the subtasks, or what are the subtasks that we need, and what are the kind of UI elements that we need to build, what is fundamental? And so we kind of structured like these milestones and product releases around that. And like kind of as time has gone on, we have this kind of bigger library, and we can freely run a lot more experiments than we could before. But so we kind of structured what UI we built in what order to be focused around particular product releases. Yes.
Can you talk about the development of the whole kind of
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we were able to work on this for like almost a year, and you don't get that many opportunities to kind of build a core infrastructure, especially on a growth team sometimes. And we kind of just wanted, we kind of addressed like the problems that, we kind of brought up all the problems that we kind of talked about in this talk with more concrete examples, and kind of sold that as an idea of like, what if we could do this a lot better and a lot faster? And so we were able to kind of sell it in that way, that this would just be like a much better way to run experiments, because clearly what we're doing right now isn't the best, I think.
All right, last question.
Yes. That's a great question. Yeah, so we do all our translation on the server side as well, and based on information about the request, we can serve the correct language.
There's that great translation that they kind of crowdsource.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Thanks so much.
All right, so we've reached our last talk of the evening, and our next speaker, his name is Alan Blair, and he's an engineer on the growth engagement team here at Pinterest. And prior to Pinterest, he was working on Wall Street at JP Morgan as an investment banker. So please welcome Alan.
Hey, I did not approve that intro. But I really want to talk about keeping your resurrected users out of the grave. Michael talked a little bit about resurrected users. They're really important. Depends on the company, but for Pinterest, they're extremely important. So obviously, I want to go over just like a little bit of an agenda, context, like what is a resurrected user, why are they important. We're going to talk about targeting. Who is a resurrected user? Like, where do they go to? What do they do? Then we're going to talk about some experiments. Everyone loves learning. So if you're a growth engineer, you probably love this stuff. And then a little bit about culture. It's not easy to get a bunch of users who come to all different parts of the app, a good experience. You need a lot of people. It takes a village. So let's start off with context. So a little bit of like preamble. Resurrected users, they come in all the time, and if you're not doing anything with them, they probably just have some sort of regular activation rate or something like that. And you should always, look for new growth opportunities. And this is a channel that a lot of people just don't think about. So what is a resurrected user, right? So let's say like you go to Pinterest, you sign up, have a good experience, but you never use Pinterest for like a year. And then somehow, some way, someone tells you, hey, check out this pin I have. Or like, I'm like having a baby shower. Come like add some extra pins, or like check out these pins or something along those lines. You come back to the site, right? You are now a resurrected user. You were signed up a long time ago, a year ago, and you just came back. So now you have somehow gotten into my funnel, and I'm looking for you. So why are they important? If you look at this chart, you have starting users, ending users, and you're like, oh, well, I'm doing really great, right? Like, I grew 7 users, like 70% year-over-year growth. I'm killing it. What actually happened? So, like, I'm sure a lot of you already know about growth accounting, but I just thought I'd reiterate. There's new users, there's churn users, and then there's people who come back. And that's actually how we end up getting to our end user state. So you might be doing really well, like by getting a ton of users, but if you're churning all of them, then you're actually not growing your total user base. And so the last piece, which sometimes people forget about, is the resurrected user, the unsung hero of the growth chart. But they're super important because these are people who already signed up and they come back to your service and they resurrect and they keep coming back. So let's talk a little bit about targeting. Like who is a resurrected user? Like I gave like a pretty extreme example. You don't use Pinterest for an entire year. Like no one does that, right? So like when we originally started thinking about this topic, at least on our team, we were like, all right, well, Pinterest, we had to define like a dormant user as someone who didn't come around for a year, or excuse me, not a year, a month. And so we thought about that, and we actually thought, that feels a little aggressive, right? Like, are you really dormant if you're not around for a month? Like, you might look at gardening tips on Tuesday, and then like a month later, you look at a recipe, right? Like, does that mean you're really dormant? So we actually extended that time period. But this was right for Pinterest. It doesn't necessarily mean that's right for your app or your product or your team. So we used the 3-month dormancy rate, and we call these people Z91. So for 90 days, they had been dormant, and then they came back. So where do these people come from, right? Like, how do they actually get back on Pinterest? This is a pretty interesting chart. Some of these numbers look a little small here. Oh, they look okay up there. So you can see that a lot of people come back directly. Some people come back from like SEO. So like 13% of people come from notifications, and some people come from other. So it's actually pretty awesome that a lot of people are actually coming direct. They have a use case in mind. They want to come to Pinterest. And a lot of these people are coming back to mobile apps, and some of these people are coming back to the web. Obviously, most of search traffic comes to the web. And so this really helped us determine, what do we focus on? Where are these users coming in on? What experiences are they having? And then the next logical question is, when they come in, what are they up to? So this is an interesting chart that some of the data people on our team worked on. I like it a lot. Basically, it shows by traffic, how many surfaces did you interact with? So you can see here direct traffic, they actually interact with 2 surfaces, right? So that person typed in www.pinterest.com, came to the home feed, and then they searched something. They searched a little bit, did some more stuff. So they're interacting a lot. While a person who came in through an email or something, they didn't actually do much of anything. They kind of saw what they came for, and then they left. So this was really important to us, because this tells us that the direct users are actually higher engaged. They really care. Like, they're actually doing stuff. They're engaged users. Like, we probably have a good chance of activating them. Like a search traffic user, probably we also have like a better chance than a notifications user, but not quite as good of a chance as a direct user. Now this might seem like intuitive, but it's good to have the data. So let's put it all together, right? Let's focus on search traffic and direct. Let's not focus on notifications or other. We have limited resources. Let's try and focus on the right thing here. And I say that because we didn't know what we were doing. This is our first time tackling resurrections, so we wanted to pick the things that had the highest impact, so we could start working on things as fast as possible that move metrics, and we could get buy-in from other teams. So let's talk about how we move some metrics, right? Like, let's talk about some experiments. So let's talk about utility. So what we wanted to do was just make it easier for users to accomplish what they came for. This seems like a really simple experiment, because it is. We removed background images from some guides that we had. So what does that do? It's like a small increase in performance, right? Less images that are loaded. We did a bunch of these. And so what we did is, on all of these landing pages that people were coming from search, is we just made the experience faster. We chipped away, and so we had about a 10% decrease in user wait time. And that was very good for resurrected users. And so this was actually for all types of users, but we saw that retention gains actually did occur more frequently for these resurrected users, because they care about performance more. A core user who engages with Pinterest all the time, they don't care about performance quite as much, right? Because they already know Pinterest is great, they're going to wait. A resurrected user who is basically new to the service, right? Like, after 90 days, haven't been to Pinterest in a while, they're like, oh, this is a fresh new experience. They care about the speed. Let's talk a little bit about education, right? So education is also something really important. And what we did was something, once again, seems really simple, like something that we should just have. Labels on the nav bar. So one of the things that we kept hearing from user research was that people didn't know what these buttons meant. Like, what's 2 people on top of each other? What's a compass mean? And so we put labels there so people could actually understand what's going on. And so we saw outsized increases in reactivation. And then personalization is something that we also worked on, which was very important. One of the things that's interesting is this is actually our new user experience, very similar to what Michael was talking about. And so we just showed our new user experience, again, to these resurrected users. And this kind of just harkens back to the strategy that we had before when we were targeting. We wanted people who hadn't been to Pinterest in a long time. We don't want to, take someone who just was here and then show them this experience. We wanted to really feel like this person hasn't been in a while. Welcome back, right? Like, how you doing? Check out some new stuff. So that they actually feel like they can change their feed and have a new experience. And this also had a really outsized activation or reactivation win as well, which was really awesome. So just some results. By the end of that year, we had launched 250 experiments. We had shipped 50 of them, and we had increased the reactivation rate by 10%. It was basically at first like, just stabbing in the dark, shotgun, like try everything, try anything, and see what works. And as time went on, we began to hone in on what our strategy was, what worked, and next thing you know, we're really moving numbers, and we started actually making a difference for these resurrected users. So one thing that we did, or like that was a part of, making this happen and making this successful, was culture. Who owns these users, right? It's not easy to tell someone who might feel like they own a product that, hey, that experience isn't really quite that good for a resurrected user or a low engaged user, right? Like sometimes people tend to think about power users or power pinners or whatever you want to call it. So everyone should care about all of the users. And so what's really important is the growth team can shine a spotlight on resurrected users, but it's important for everyone to care and for everyone to kind of welcome them with open arms. So once again, knitting is a thing that we do at Pinterest. Have to do this call out since we're here. And when we say knitting, we mean collaboration, right? Like a little one of these, right? So you have to collaborate with other teams. And one of the teams that we collaborated a lot with was the new user experience team. So what we actually ended up finding was a lot of new user experience things actually work really well for resurrected users. And so we would actually run experiments that we ran for resurrected users on new users and vice versa. And we started collaborating and pairing. And next thing you know, both of us won. And so that was what was really great about this experience was it was a cross-functional effort, and Pinterest was the ultimate winner. And pinners were the ultimate winner. But yeah, and finally, you got to share a common goal. Resurrected users sometimes can feel like they're coming in at a trickle, or it's a very small amount of the user base. But you really need to be able to trace up your impact to the top line so other teams can understand what your value is and why it's important to make sure that these users are good. So what we did was we had this reactivation rate, which was really easy to understand in growth, but it might not have been as easy to understand on say the home feed team or the search team. So what we did was we actually traced it up to a user visitation number that we could share and that we could all compare across different surfaces. And so that allowed us to get buy-in from different groups and be able to essentially share the same goal and work together. Want to thank everyone for the talk. Little sell here. We're hiring if you're interested. And I want to open up for Q&A.
Thanks for the talk. Very impressive. A couple questions. How do you, what's the major difference you think is the new user versus the, what do you call it again? Reserved, yeah, the user, sorry. And for personalization purpose, how long as history of this, the user you'll go back to look for versus view it as a brand new user?
Yeah, I can start on the first one. So the difference, obviously the main difference is you have information on a resurrected user. You don't have one on a new user, but that can lead you astray. I can actually just mix these together. If you end up using some of the information that previously activated the user in the past, you might be pulling in a topic that they didn't really like, right? Like if someone came for a wedding and they had their wedding, or they didn't have their wedding, it can be difficult to put that back in their home feed after a Nux experience. So the way that we did it was, depending on the type of user, how long they've been dormant, we would either completely refresh their experience, or we would, just do a small refresh of their experience, or a small refresh of their home page and their home feed. And the main difference, though, between the two of them is the new user, you're selling them for the first time. the resurrected user, they kind of know what your product already does. So you can't be too spammy, like, oh, this is how you click on buttons and stuff like that. So like, they're not apples to apples completely, but you can apply some of the larger things to both. Pinterest engineers. No, just kidding. Basically, his question was, how did you run so many experiments? It seems like a lot. So we actually have something similar to what the Twitter team already has in place, which allows us to run a lot of different experiences and experiments. We just have it's just a strong growth mentality where it's like, get in as many experiments as you can and try as many things. And like, it doesn't matter how small it is or how big. Everyone is contributing ideas and like putting in different stuff. So it ends up like, you're iterating on things. You might like have an experiment and then you change like 4 different colors or change 5 different variants of copy. That ends up being like 6 experiments, while in reality, the real work was the first experiment. And so the iterative process can create or inflate that experiment number in total. But what's important is that you're doing a lot of it.
So quick question about like how you guys chose. So I remember in one of your previous slides, you guys chose like to target like direct and search because you think like those 2 channels are like with the highest impact. Can you elaborate a little bit more like how you guys think like why you guys thought like those 2 are highest impact? Just because like they have the highest like average number of statistics like before doing anything. Does that mean that they should be the
Yeah, basically his question was like, why did you choose direct and search traffic as the 2 targets? We chose them because they're the biggest. Like we just wanted to get as many people as possible to see our new experiences, and we thought that those 2 were good choices. It was pretty simple. It's like, oh, well, like people are engaging on this surface, and this is like one of our larger populations, so let's just do that. What do you mean? So the way that we count if you are a resurrected user is if you just come. Reactivation itself is, I'm gonna pass on that one on like what we define as reactivation and things like that. Yeah, so, I can thank the PMs on our team for that. So basically it started with talking to leadership and explaining to them what the opportunity looked like. And then from there, it was like getting a couple early wins and then communicating that out to everyone. And then having the meetings and one-on-ones with different teams and saying, hey, these are how my users or the users I'm focused on interact with your surface. It was a process, like this happened over a year. So in the beginning, it was harder. Towards the end, it was easier. And then everyone kind of knew what they were by the end of the year.
I like the way you chose the biggest area to kind of boil in the ocean. Have you seen later maybe pins from social network posts or other things showing you different tracks where they're getting more surface areas, or maybe other signals generally you could speak about, not specifically, that really let you know that maybe these are first and clear intent, but these other traffic areas or these other areas had a higher long-term LTV for reactivating people who were resurrected?
We haven't looked into it that deeply. Basically, his question was around like, do these other surfaces potentially have like a higher chance of activation for long-term value? Yeah, we didn't do that. So like once we tackled that, I don't think we kept on like iterating and going into depth of that nature.
I think it would be a better track where maybe people are placing pins in like product hunt or other places that maybe gets people back reactivated, maybe a thing for you to focus on. So
maybe. Yeah.
Because I actually literally was a resurrected user. I found some posts in places just like that that totally got me back.
Cool. Thank you, Alan. All right. I first wanted to give just another round of applause to all our speakers, Alan, Ganesh, and Michael. Great talks today from all of you. I also wanted to give a warm round of applause to the people who helped make this event happen. So our tech support team, Pin Patrol, and our workplace team. We couldn't have had this without you guys. So that brings us to the end of the event. I wanted to thank you all for coming. You can hang out here and mingle until 9 o'clock, and then we have to be out of here. But there's still more drinks if you want, and just hang out and meet people. We have signs in the back for different topics. So there's a sign around acquisition and engagement if you want to meet people working in that area. And our next growth engineering event will be in July, hosted by LinkedIn. So join the Meetup group if you're not a part of it, and we'll notify you guys when the next event. Thank you all for coming.